Right, so before I can start running the boost hoses, I need to actually mount the intercooler. So we're going to reuse the intercooler that Sam had on the diesel before. So I've just made a couple mounting tabs up. So I'm going to weld them on the front of the core support on that piece that I added. So it's actually quite handy that I put that thick piece of steel in there now, because we're going to pick it up and support that intercooler really well off the front of that. We can make some brackets from the top or something as well to pick up the brackets on the top. So you can see with the radiator in there now, it's quite handy being that little bit narrower, because it gives you this extra room down the side for running those two intercooler hoses. And notoriously with a 306, with the factory, with a full width radiator, it's really tight getting hoses through there. Hence all of this stuff gets bent and smashed up when people are trying to get hoses through. So that'll be quite tidy there now. So I'm going to scratch some paint off here underneath and on top here, and we'll weld those brackets on there. Put some paint back on it again, and then we've got an intercooler in position, somewhere to work from with the hoses then. Right there, nice and simple. I've welded on those two tabs now for the intercooler, so that'll bolt in there now. And I expect I'm going to try and do something like I did on my green car and run a bar across the top to pick up the two top bolts. Possibly not strictly necessary, but over time I can pretty much guarantee that those two things will crack off the bottom of the intercooler if you don't support it in the top as well. Right, okay, after editing that last video, it became fairly apparent that I had somehow managed to completely skip any other videos on the drive shafts, and a few people were asking questions on that. So, on the floor there, that's the two mock-up shafts that I ended up making. So you've got the outer piece and the inner piece. So I just welded them together to form a fixed template or example shaft. I was then able to send both of those off. They're actually both exactly the same length each side, which is quite good. Sent them off, had some proper shafts machined, had them heat treated. They then came back again, which is the centres here. Obviously then I've put new CV boots on, re-greased the CV joints and fitted them to the car. So they ended up coming out really nice, pleased with them. And they look literally factory, you wouldn't know they aren't supposed to be there. So that's how that all came together. Just looking from underneath now, so you can see where that oil return comes down into the sump. If I just sneak the camera in through there, and we've got the sun pointing at us as well, but the oil pressure line is coming off just above the oil filter there. I think you can see it in focus there now. And we've got a take off there as well for oil pressure sensor. So the line comes off there, follows up around to the turbo, follows the same path as the return. You also see lower rad hoses on, that's factory. The upper rad hose is up there and that's factory. You can just see that clutch cable bracket from underneath, that earth strap. There's no reason actually now why I couldn't put transmission oil in it, but I'll probably just leave that for a minute just in case we do have to rip this apart again. You see the alternator and the aux belt set up. It's all pretty tight, but it's all serviceable. The belt fits past the pulley, so you can change that fairly easily in situ. Crank pulley is nice and easy to access. Oil filter is nice and easy to access. Drive shafts come in and out like factory. We've got the factory wiring harness rerouted across the bottom of that core support now. Obviously got those intercooler mounts on the bottom. So we're just going to start working on the boost hoses next. Just made up a little bracket for the top of the intercooler, so it's just picking up those two lugs and the centre bolt there. So it's not really taking any weight as such, but it just means the intercooler is absolutely solid and it takes the vibration out of it. A lot of people wouldn't bother with that, and to be fair, it would probably largely be fine. But what happens is the intercooler vibrates and eventually it will crack those two mounting lugs off the bottom. So you just add that in there, it takes 5 minutes, and it means the intercooler is rock solid and you haven't got to worry about it shearing off. Right, so I've been having a little think last couple of days where the best place to put the coolant puke tank or the overflow tank would be. I got this little gap over here, but we have got the washer fluid filler neck comes up here and it kind of makes that very inaccessible. That area is just not really big enough. I don't want it anywhere over there because we're obviously dealing with heat and stuff over there. And this area I'm trying to reserve for the air filter. So then I was looking down in this gap here thinking we could have a cylindrical, like an aftermarket alley puke tank down in here. So I thought I'd go and get the factory puke tank off the Civic. I wanted to fill it up with water and then measure how much water it held, so I had a rough idea of the kind of capacity I wanted. And I just thought, oh, I'll bring it over here. As that turns out, that factory coolant tank, once you've cut that little piece there away and squeezed her in there, fits in that gap like a dream. Neck comes up right where you can get to it, right next to the radiator. And it slides down in that gap there. So I drilled all the spot welds. There's a little mounting plate that the header tank slots down into on the chassis of the Civic. So I drilled the spot welds out of that, removed that, made a little bracket, welded it onto there, and that just slots down in there like factory. You just lift it up and it pulls out right out the top of the car. We've just got 3 riv nuts there and 3 bolts to secure it. So that's actually worked out quite well as well. So that's the coolant. That is the coolant system pretty much complete then. All I've got to do is just finish off those heater hoses around the back, and we'll hook that up obviously to the coolant overflow there, and that should be good to go. Right, so we've got that fuel tank bolted back up now. That's all up where it belongs in the factory location. Put the exhaust back on again. So we've got the 2 fuel lines that come down around, run an inline filter there, and then they just follow the original route up the bottom of the chassis. Just use some clips there to bolt that along, and then obviously just follows the chassis leg up into the engine bay, which I'll show you now. So then I've brought those 2 fuel lines up that chassis leg, mount the fuel pressure regulator on the bulkhead here, and then the feed comes round to the rail. The return goes back again, obviously. Got a pressure gauge in there for setting it up as well. We'll also be mounting a fuel pressure sensor in the rail, just so we've got that in the ECU. Only thing left to do there is just run a reference line off the bottom of that regulator to the intake so that the fuel is boost referenced. So I think we finally reached that point in time in the project where it's time to start tackling the wiring. So we've got basically everything else put together. So still a few jobs that need doing, one of which is a catch can. You see we've got the 2 fittings on the rocker cover there. I think that's probably something Sam's going to tackle afterwards, because it isn't going to make a big difference to us. When we're tuning it and stuff, we'll just put some pipes on them into a bucket, and that won't be a problem. There's no power steering setup on the car at the moment. The plan is to go electric power steering, pretty much the same as what I've got in my DT. So if you look back in the videos, it's basically probably going to end up being similar to that. Again, Sam's probably going to tackle that himself once he's got it back. So he'll probably be mounting a power steering pump somewhere down where I did down there, and a little reservoir up here somewhere, or wherever. And then obviously we'll just have an output off the ECU to trigger a relay, and that'll be the power steering. And there's probably a few other little bits and pieces I've forgotten about that still need sorting out, but largely mechanically now it's together. So I want to start tackling the wiring. So in one of the first videos we mentioned we originally were intending on using the factory ECU with the K Pro. Basically decided against that because, well, my general experience with using factory ECUs can just be a real pain in the neck. So for ease of tuning and future expansion possibilities, going with an aftermarket ECU, as I did in my car, is just generally always a better idea from my experience. Obviously more expensive, but it's one of those things that once you've got it, you can kind of use it on, you know, different cars in the future. You haven't got to necessarily keep it on this one. So it's kind of like an investment. So we've gone with a Haltech Elite Series ECU, which is going to obviously be mounted inside the car. It can be mounted in the engine bay, but I'm going to try and mount it inside the car. So being a common engine with the K20 and the Civic, Haltech actually make like a plug and play harness kit. Idea being, if you've got an EP3 Civic or whatever, you can just unplug the factory ECU, plug in the adapter and plug in the Haltech and run a couple extra wires if you've got a boost control and stuff like that, and it should just, plug and play, it should just work. It seems though we've got the original wiring harness from the Civic and it's in reasonably good condition. It seemed to make sense to actually use that adapter on this as well, because it saves having to basically cut the factory harness and repin the whole thing. So the plan is to fit the factory, I'm going to take the factory harness apart because there's some wires in it that need to come out, which we don't obviously need anymore. There's quite a few wires to add, so we've got the stuff like the oil temperature, oil pressure, fuel pressure sensors, the solenoid valve for the boost control, and other little bits and pieces that are going to need adding into the harness, and we'll run it all back in at once. I've already made a little sub harness, which is you can just about make it out, going into the factory bulkhead connector, which obviously originally used to have the whole engine harness on it. All that's really being used on that now is going to be the starter enable and the reverse switch. Everything else will be going through the top loom and back to the Haltech or whatever we've got going on inside. Including the alternator was originally going to be obviously on the factory loom, but the alternators on these are actually externally regulated, so the ECU actually drives the regulator circuit in the alternator. So that is actually now, instead of being connected to the original connector, that's all going to go back to the ECU as well. We've actually already got a hole in the bulkhead from where Sam had all his cables going through before. I don't know if I'll use that or not. I probably would have rather go through here somewhere, but it seems that we've got that hole there, it would make sense probably to use it. Only problem being whether we've got enough length on that Honda harness to get all the way up there, having going that way. So I'm going to, in a minute, I'm going to strip that down a bit and just lay it on the engine roughly and just see whether we've got the length to get back inside the car or not. Because if we don't, it might be a better option to come through here somewhere and then just blank that off, which would probably end up being tidier. We'll have to wait and see. So the first thing to do here is to tear this apart a bit more and just get it back to a more flexible loom so we can do something with it. So we've got the loom on the floor still. I haven't done any videoing because it's pretty boring, to be honest. So I've stripped out all the crap. Quite a few wires we didn't need. Obviously the battery connections and stuff like that is separate now, so I've taken that out. A few sensors that we're replacing with either a better sensor or just we don't need have gone. You can see I've added some extra wires, so that's for like the boost control, the oil and fuel pressure, oil temp, and just various things like that. I have also pulled a couple extra wires to 2 different places in the loom, just because you always find later down the road you want to add something, and it's so much easier if you've already pulled some cables through the harness. So they'll just be labelled up spare, coiled up behind the dash, and if you ever need to, at least you've got them in the engine bay on the engine, and it just saves having always additional looms, which is what you inevitably always end up with, and lots of extra wires that just look untidy. So we've done that. I haven't final taped it yet. I haven't obviously sleeved and shortened and put connectors on the ends because I'm not too sure on the length. So the next step is going to be to lay that in on the vehicle, run it roughly where we need it, run these new tails to where I've got the new sensors and stuff. We can then mark them, cut them to length, take it out again, put the connectors on, put the sleeving on, and then hopefully that can be all secured correctly. We got lucky in that the original harness from the Civic is, now that I've removed all the weird containment and extra wires and stuff, the long piece on the end that goes inside the car is long enough, as we said, well, as we were talking about before, to run underneath, well away from the hot side of the turbo, up round the edge and through that existing hole, just enough length then to terminate them into the adapter there behind the dash. And it's quite nice because the adapter then has 2 flying leads between the adapter and the ECU, which gives you another like 2 feet of cable. So the ECU will be able to go wherever we like. So I'm going to flop this on the engine now and get a rough idea of how it's going to sit, and then we'll go from there. So I just pulled the little plate off the bottom of the inlet manifold. I think I mentioned in a previous video that I was going to tap this out for some hose barbs. So I'm just marked up, we're going to put 4 in. We only need 3 for a minute, but I'm going to leave a spare because I think it's quite likely quite likely a blow-off valve will get added at some point, and it's just always handy to have extra takeoffs to save teeing pipes everywhere. So we'll drill 4 holes in the bottom of that, we'll tap them out, and we'll thread those 4 hose barbs in, refit that back to the car, and then we can connect up those hoses that at the minute are just left alone dangling under the inlet. So you saw in that previous clip I drilled some holes in that factory plate, but pretty much the second I drilled the holes it was fairly clear really that wasn't going to work. This is way thinner than I thought it was going to be. So I was going to weld a plate on the top to thicken it up, and then I thought, well, it is just basically a flat plate sitting on a flat flange. Obviously welding it not ideal because it's probably going to warp it and cause issues, but more to the point, it would be a lot quicker and easier to just make that again because it's just a flat piece of alley. So we've just cut a piece of alley, drilled the bolt holes in it, got the 4 barbs and that temperature sensor mounted in there. So now we can bolt this on the car, connect everything up. Well, it's a little bit difficult to see, but I've bolted that plate up in there now. So you can see got the air temperature sensor there at one end. We've got those 4 barbs the other end. So 3 of them are being used, and one of them you can see has got a bung in it as a spare. Fairly likely that we'll probably add a blow-off valve at some point, or Sam will. So I've left a port there, easy available for that. And I imagine it'll probably be just weld the flange on the corner of that boost pipe there, because there's plenty of room there and the pipe can just run straight across into in there. Now while we're under here, you can see all the wiring is done, the alternator's wired up, starter's wired up, got that lower radiator hose on there, wiring harness across there, factory harness, ground cable. So it's all kind of crammed in, but it all fits in there. And it's all relatively serviceable. In fact, I actually had the starter out earlier because I couldn't get the terminal on the solenoid because it was obviously bent. So I had to pull that out to sort of sort that out. And it's actually relatively easy. You can work a 3/8 ratchet up there, no trouble. So we're all together. Hopefully, what else have we not shown? Got that oil temperature sensor in the bottom there. Obviously brought the wiring up around the back. We've got the oil pressure sensor, it's hard to see, but that's tucked away in the back there as well. All the bolts are on, all the coolant hoses are on. So everything is pretty much together now. I'm going to actually tip some engine oil in it in a minute, just so that definitely doesn't get forgotten about. Still got transmission oil to do and coolant, but I won't bother with the coolant until I've just got it running for the first time, in case we got to pull it out or something drastic has to happen. Once you put coolant in it, you just end up making such a mess, taking stuff apart again. So we will just start it dry for the first few seconds, just to make sure we're all good.